So welcome to Oncology Data Advisor. Today I have the honor of being joined by Dr. Harpreet Singh, who is the Chief Medical Officer at Precision for Medicine and formerly the Division Director of Oncology at the FDA. So recently, the FDA issued new draft guidance on accelerated approvals and confirmatory trials, which will fundamentally alter the drug approval landscape. Today, Dr. Singh is joining us to share her insights into what this new guidance means. Dr. Singh, thanks so much for coming on today. To start off, we'd like to introduce yourself and share a little bit about what you do.
Sure, thanks so much for having me. I'm Harpreet Singh. I'm an oncologist, and my current role is Chief Medical Officer of Precision for Medicine. Precision is a global clinical research organization. We conduct clinical trials in oncology and rare disease. We work very closely with Biotech, which is really a major draw for me in this role. Before coming to Precision, I served as a division director at FDA's Oncology Center of Excellence. I was there for nearly a decade and oversaw the development of multiple solid tumor programs. So thanks so much for having me.
Awesome. Thanks for the introduction. So for background, before we get into the new draft guidance, would you like to tell us a little bit about the Accelerated Approval Program and the role of confirmatory trials?
Yeah, well, the Accelerated Approval Program was developed in the early 90s. I'm not sure, a lot of people don't know, that it was actually developed in response to the HIV/AIDS crisis. And the idea was that the traditional paradigm for regulatory approvals, or what we now call traditional or regular approvals, relied on endpoints and in trial designs that really took a long time to get to those endpoints. And patients were dying of HIV/AIDS as heart medication was being made available. And what really the parallels between HIV/AIDS and oncology, as particularly solid tumor oncology, are that you had an endpoint, an earlier endpoint, which could measure success of the drug or the combination of drugs. And so the idea behind accelerated approval from the early 90s is that you could take an asset and conduct a trial that had what we call then surrogate endpoints, but really they're earlier or intermediate endpoint signals that the drug is effective, and then grant what we call an accelerated approval, which is kind of like a conditional approval, if you will, to make the drug immediately available to patients, and then follow that through with what we call a confirmatory trial. So that became a reliable early endpoint or intermediate endpoint. So those were the first use cases of accelerated approval. That then evolved to oncology, to where now you had, I believe, almost 2/3 of accelerated approvals over time since the early 90s have been in oncology. And that's because in oncology, there's another earlier endpoint, which is tumor response rate or overall response rate. The idea being that you could conduct, in most cases, a single-arm trial with fewer patients and pick up an earlier signal of response rate, and that could give regulators confidence that this is an effective drug for a life-threatening illness, whatever malignancy the drug was treating, and that FDA would extend that accelerated approval, and then it was the onus of the sponsor to prove, usually in a randomized trial with a longer endpoint, a time to event endpoint, like progression-free survival or overall survival, that drug was in fact better than the control. And just going back, the accelerated approvals, in order to even be considered for an accelerated approval, by definition, you have to be seen as better than what's available for patients. Otherwise, there's no really reason to take that regulatory risk. And in fact, it is a regulatory risk, right? Because these endpoints are not necessarily validated, in a sense that not every accelerated approval, those endpoints don't always translate into long-term benefit in that confirmatory trial or against the control. So you're risking, from the time you grant the accelerated approval to the time the benefit is confirmed in another trial or a different trial or a randomized trial, you're putting patients potentially at risk. And exposing them to a therapy that may not translate into long-term benefit, although you're pretty confident that there is benefit on that earlier endpoint. And so that's a risk that the regulators take, and then we pass on to patients and providers. And so the confirmatory trials are meant to mitigate that risk.
Awesome. Thanks so much for explaining. It definitely helps to understand the program a little bit better. So what does this new draft guidance from the FDA specify, and what is kind of its goal?
Yes, so the new draft guidance, there's a few different guidances, but they're on generally accelerated approval, and one is specifically from the Oncology Center of Excellence about confirmatory trials being underway or well underway at the time of accelerated approval. And this actually stems from a congressional act in 2023, late 23, and which gave the FDA more authority, to not approve an accelerated approval or a drug that has been shown to be safe and effective, but to not approve the drug if the confirmatory trial is not underway. You may ask, what is this in response to? Because usually, these types of regulations don't come out of nowhere. So, it's a little bit about that risk, that lag time. And there's certainly the risk that companies may not actually conduct these confirmatory trials. So that's what we call a dangling accelerated approval. So the FDA grants the accelerated approval, and it's just kind of hanging out there. And things can happen in drug development, like the clinical trial could fail. They could have trouble enrolling in this trial, particularly if in the United States the drug is made available through accelerated approval. There may be a perceived loss of equipoise to then enroll on a randomized trial against a control arm when FDA has already said, under the premise of accelerated approval, we believe that this drug is better than what's available. That's why we granted accelerated approval. So there's many reasons to have a confirmatory trial and de-risk your program and de-risk for patients before you hit that accelerated approval. But also there were a few companies who did not meet these their post-marketing requirements in a timely fashion or didn't meet them at all. I will say in the oncology space, the median time to convert is about 3 years from an accelerated to a traditional approval, which I think that's reasonable given timelines in drug development, but certainly we wouldn't want that to be extended any further. So what the guidance talks about is basically explaining some of this rationale, why FDA is pursuing this, why this guidance is being written, and also just making it clear that FDA expects discussion early and often about the entire development program, and that includes how one would get to that accelerated approval, and then at what point in their confirmatory trial they would need to be in order to expect basically a green light for that approval. The guidance doesn't go so far as to give numbers or enrollment rates, percent enrolled, which I know we're probably all looking for. They really wanted, if you're reading through the guidance, it really emphasizes flexibility. And I think that's very important because there may be drug development challenges that can't be foreseen in advance. And if you are developing an asset for a really rare tumor type or a rare disease for which there's no available therapies, FDA may choose to grant some flexibility to this provision about confirmatory trials being well underway. And that may be appropriate. And then simultaneously, they're working with that sponsor to figure out what's delaying the timelines. How can we, make sure that you we're de-risking this program and the confirmatory trial gets up and running. On the other hand, if there's many drugs in this class or other drugs available for patients, and the FDA feels that the sponsor has had ample time, opportunity, discussions to initiate and get that trial going, they may choose to exercise this authority and issue what we call a CRL, or what FDA calls a CRL, or a complete response letter, which would be an action taken to not grant that accelerated approval. And that did in fact happen last March.
Great, thank you for explaining everything. Definitely helps to put it all into context. So, what exactly does this mean for biopharmaceutical companies, and what kind of impact will it have on fundraising and regulatory timeline management?
That's a great question. I think biotech is still trying to figure out what this means. I'll address this from two perspectives. One is from a purely scientific data perspective, and I think for those CMOs and CSOs and head of clinical development that are looking at that early data that's being generated, that signal-seeking data, I think it's going to be really important to look at every single piece of data that comes out, patient-level data, translational data. Certainly here at Precision, we run clinical trials, global trials in oncology, and we have a translational component as well. And so understanding all that PK, pharmacodynamic data, all the tumor expression, and what I'm getting at is you're going to need every data point, both clinical and translational. They're even more important, I think, now than ever before, the data coming out of early phase trials, because we're going to have to make decisions, big decisions, clinical development, trial design decisions, what therapeutic area, which solid tumor are we going into based on more limited information. We don't have as much time anymore, as much runway to see the data develop across perhaps multiple tumor types, or multiple dose ranges, or combination strategies. If we're starting to see a signal in one tumor type, there may have to be some quick decision making to move forward into, for example, a confirmatory trial in that tumor type. And so I think you're removing risk earlier on, so a little bit higher risk by making these decisions, and at the same time being forced to raise enough capital to essentially conduct two trials in parallel. If you're going to go that traditional accelerated approval, traditional approval route, and that traditional path is you get about, I'm going to ballpark it, roughly 100 patients, maybe less, maybe more, give or take 20 patients in a single arm setting, you garner a response rate in a tumor type, you go for that accelerated approval, and in parallel, you've already initiated the confirmatory trial randomized against a control. That was already happening in tandem, but I think for biotech, where there can be more challenges in terms of capital raising, and also more of a demand from investors and boards to see clinical data in order and see results, right? So knowing that you're going to get that accelerated approval then generates more capital to run the confirmatory trial. But now you need that up front in order to satisfy FDA's new requirements. So I think early scientific decision making on less data, more capital, and also though, you could decide not to even pursue an accelerated approval. You could decide that you're going to take that early phase data that Precision could generate, or that you're running in your early phase trial, and then go straight from that data, that signal seeking, hypothesis generating data, get a lot of input, get a lot of data points, and go straight into a registrational design. Companies could choose to bypass that single arm trial. Again, I think a little risky, but you're just placing risk in different places.
Definitely. Sounds like a lot of decision making to be done there.
Yes.
So what advice would you have for navigating this new environment effectively?
Well, the first piece of advice I would have is to get a great thought partner, somebody who really understands the complex regulatory landscape. Um, and then to the point about data, make sure that your early phase trials are smart in their design so that you're maximizing data from every patient. Again, all the PK, PD, the tumor expression data. So really getting in with a partner, a CRO partner potentially that has that early phase experience and is really flexible in terms of different dose escalation designs and just ways to kind of save patients but still get expeditious results. I think checking in with FDA early and often, and again, that comes back to probably having a thought partner, someone on your team or someone you can tap into who can say, now would be a good time to talk to the FDA about this, and this would be a good avenue to do that. So that you are in fact aligned. So if you're having any challenges or you're having any questions about what a good pathway could be based on the data you're generating, that you're engaging them.
Great. Well, thank you for sharing this advice. As a wrap up, any other parting messages you'd like to share about this new guidance?
I think the guidance presents some challenges, but also some opportunities. Let's take a look at this and look at it for the premise, right? Which is that we all want the same thing, including FDA. We all want to get safe and effective therapies to patients as quickly as possible. And some of the tenets of this guidance are really about de-risking for patients and making sure that we're delivering drugs and assets that are in fact proving out that long-term benefit.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Singh, for coming on today to share these insights with us and helping walk us through this new landscape.
Thank you so much for having me.